Good day, everyone. Welcome to this video lecture on how to write the conceptual framework of thesis and dissertations. This video lecture is part and parcel of my class, Education 505, Methods of Research at the Graduate School of Eastern Visayas State University. And please take note that I implemented a blended learning modality in my class. So I combine face-to-face sessions and some performance tasks in our Moodle as our learning management system. That is why this video lecture. So after this, I upload the lecture to Moodle as our LMS. Okay, let me proceed right away to the discussion. Let me start with the objectives of the study or objectives of this lecture. I have three objectives here. The first one is to define and explain the concept of a conceptual framework. Second is to understand the rationale behind the writing of the conceptual framework. And objective number three is to explain very briefly, of course, the process in writing a conceptual framework. So as you can see, especially in my other video lectures, I always have the habit of including in my lectures the what, the why, and the how. So the main intention of this lecture is to share with you some techniques on how to write the conceptual framework, but I need to begin with a brief discussion on the definition of what really is a conceptual framework and why the need to include this in our thesis or dissertations. So the discussion that follows will align to these three objectives, of course. And let me now start with the meaning and nature and dynamics of the conceptual framework. So what really is a conceptual framework? Let me briefly define it. Um, okay. So a conceptual framework is a structured representation of the key concepts and variables and the way they relate with each other within the study. As I will explain later on or in the next few slides, the conceptual framework is all about the relationship between and among the key concepts and variables and factors in the study. And in a quantitative research method, for example, we talk about variables, and the main intention there is to measure the relationship between and among variables. In qualitative research, we don't have variables the way it is understood in quantitative research, but in lieu of that, we have key concepts. That is why in our definition of the conceptual framework, we talk about key concepts and variables. And there's also other factors that might be included in the conceptual framework. I will explain that later on. And the conceptual framework helps organize ideas, clarify the research problem, and guide data collection and analysis. That's how we briefly define the conceptual framework. So that we can fully understand what that is or what a conceptual framework is, let's talk about why the need to include this in our study, in our research, in our thesis or dissertation. Now, again, the conceptual framework serves as a blueprint for understanding how concepts, factors, and variables relate to each other in the study, in your thesis. Therefore, the conceptual framework helps provide a clear direction for the study. So just as in our discussion on the theoretical framework, on explaining what a theoretical framework is and why the need to include a theoretical framework, the conceptual framework also helps, provide a clear direction of the study. So the other section of our thesis or dissertation, especially proposal, that help provide the clear direction of the study are the theoretical framework, the literature review, and the background of the study, of course. But the conceptual framework is helpful in this case because, as I will show in the following slides, especially on on the discussion on the steps in writing the theoretical framework. If we're able to clearly determine the variables or the concepts or the factors that our study involve or deals with, then um, we are or the researcher can be guided properly, in the conduct of the entire research. Because just like the background of the study where we articulate there the research problem or the research gap, the conceptual framework also help set the sail of the research journey. And in addition to that, the conceptual framework as well ensures coherence and consistency throughout the entire research process. Because again, when we determine, for example, as I mentioned again, as I will mention in the next few slides on the steps in writing the conceptual framework, we need to determine the key concepts, the variables, and the factors that our study will be dealing with and align that with our research problem or research gap. And so if we are successful in doing that, and especially in explaining how these variables, how these key concepts, and how these factors relate to each other, then we will be able to clear, we will be guided properly in the conduct of the study, and the consistency and the coherence are there, of course. You will understand me later when I go into the presentation of a sample of the conceptual framework. Before I proceed to the third objective, the discussion on how to write the conceptual framework, or some guides or some tips on how to write the conceptual framework, I have two major notes here. Please take note that since in most cases the conceptual framework is used to measure the relationship between and among variables in the study, and since we don't have variables in qualitative research the way it is understood in quantitative research, then the latter does not necessarily require a conceptual framework. So again, in qualitative research, as I already mentioned, we don't use variables there. We don't have independent variables. We don't have dependent variables, moderating variables, confounding variables, and things like that. Because variables are proper only to quantitative research. And that is why in quantitative research, we have statistics there. We use statistics because our main intention there is to measure the relationship between and among variables. Like, for example, if you have a correlational study determining whether there's a significant relationship between sports program and number of drug addiction cases. So we need to clearly define the variables involved in the study and measure the relationship using some statistical tools. But in qualitative research, again, we don't have independent variables and the like. So in lieu of the variables in qualitative research, we use key concepts, we use factors, because of course, still, there are key concepts that we're dealing with in qualitative research. But anyway, the point here is in qualitative research, the conceptual framework is optional, is not necessary. But qualitative research can have, of course, a conceptual framework where we discuss how the factors or how the key concepts involved in the study relate with each other. Okay. So still we can have conceptual framework in qualitative research, but that's optional. However, so as I mentioned, however, if the intention is to determine how factors or key concepts relate to each other in a given study, then a conceptual framework may be required in a qualitative study. But most of the time, we only have, after the literature review in qualitative research, we only have the theoretical framework, and that's it. Okay, so let me proceed now to the third objective of this study, to present the steps and some techniques on how to write the conceptual framework. This is quite self-explanatory for some, but as I will mention later on, especially on the idea of the process flow, some master's and PhD students mistake the conceptual framework with the process flow. So I need to um, um, include this discussion, of course, in my class Education 505 Methods of Research. So let me walk you through to the 6 steps in preparing and writing the conceptual framework, but I'll focus on the 5th step because that's the main intention of this lecture, of this video lecture, to come up with a narrative discussion on the relationship between and among variables in the study. But let me begin with the first step, which involves identifying your research problem or gap. This is very self-explanatory. You will not be able to clearly identify your variables or key concepts later on if you don't exactly know what the problem or gap that your research is dealing with or will be dealing with, your proposal, thesis, or dissertation will be dealing with. And so that is why, as I mentioned many times already in my other video lectures, that all types of research begin with the identification or the formulation of a research problem or gap. Because if there is no research problem, as is well known, if there is no research problem or if there is no gap to fit in the study, then there is no research in the first place. Okay, so we need to identify the research problem. We need to know exactly what the problem is because it is this problem or gap that guide us in determining the variables or concepts that we will be dealing with in our study. Okay, so that by clearly stating the problem or gap that you are addressing, then you will be able to determine the scope of your variables or key concepts. For example, if your study is titled Factors Influencing Student Engagements in Online Learning Among College Students, then the scope of your variables or key concepts may focus on factors affecting student engagements in online learning environments. Okay, I think that's quite self-explanatory and it's very easy to understand. Let me proceed to step number 2, which involves determining your key concepts or your variables. Okay, so once you're clear with your research problem or gap, the next step is it's about time to determine your variables, your key concepts in the study. This involves listing down the independent variables, that is, influencing factors, for example, dependent variable or the outcome, and any moderating or mediating variables. Now, in relation to my notes a while ago, as you can see, in this case, in step number 2, we talk about clearly determining, and identifying your independent variables, dependent variable, and other moderating, mediating, or confounding variables. So this clearly shows that conceptual framework is most of the time applicable to quantitative research. And we know so well that in quantitative research, we have 4 major research designs under quantitative research, like descriptive research design, correlational research design, experimental research design, and quasi-experimental research design. All these 4 major research designs under quantitative research involve variables. And the main intention, again, in quantitative research is to measure the relationship between and among variables. That is why statisticians and quantitative researchers in general always remind us that before we proceed with our study, we need to clearly define our variables. Because if variables are not clearly defined, then we cannot proceed with the measurements of the relationship between and among these variables using some statistical tools. Okay, so again, just to reiterate the point, we don't have independent variables, dependent variable, moderating, mediating, or confounding variables in qualitative research. In lieu of the variables, the way it is understood it in quantitative research, we have key concepts or factors in qualitative research. Anyway, let me proceed to an example. For example, if the study, let me make use of this example. Factors influencing student engagement and online learning among college students, then our independent variable could be teaching strategies or technological access and learner motivation. And our dependent variable could be student engagement. Okay, so this is step two in writing the conceptual framework. Determine your key concepts or variables. And then let me proceed to step three, which involves reviewing relevant or related literature. So just like my lecture on how to write the theoretical framework, we need to review related literature. We need to review relevant or related literature so that we will be able to situate our own study and establish, of course, the scientificity or the scientific rigor of our study. And this is important because, again, we need to find out how others have defined and linked their variables, because, again, this strengthens the foundation of our framework. And especially when I say foundation, the scientificity or the scientific basis of our study. Okay, so through the conceptual framework, or the conceptual framework also helps establish the scientificity or the scientific rigor of our study by doing review of related literature. That is knowing, again, how others or other researchers define and link their variables. And in doing so, we need to use books, peer-reviewed journals, and other credible sources, of course. This is quite self-explanatory, of course. Let me proceed now to step number four, which involves establishing relationships between or among these variables. So, step one, identifying or determining your research problem and gap. And then once you know exactly your research problem or gap that you want to fill in the study, then we proceed now to determining our variables. And then here in step number four, we need now to establish their relationships. And here, this involves defining how the variables are expected to interact based on theories, findings, and assumptions. Okay, so let me proceed to step number four. This is again very self-explanatory, or let me proceed to step number five because this is quite self-explanatory. In step number five, this is now the main intention of this video lecture. I will explain to you how the framework is going to be written, because step number five involves explaining the conceptual framework in a narrative form. So once we have identified the variables in our study or the key concepts and other factors, that could influence the outcome or the findings of the study. And once we have established the relationship between and among these variables, now our task is to write the framework or to write the conceptual framework in a narrative form. And this is again the main intention of this lecture. And this is our main task in our thesis and dissertation when writing this section of our thesis and dissertation, the conceptual framework. Step number six, which involves coming up with a diagram or schematic diagram of the conceptual framework, is optional, because again, our main task in the conceptual framework is to explain in a narrative form how these variables or factors or key concepts relate to each other. Okay, so here we need to provide a written explanation of our conceptual framework, which includes definitions of each variable or definitions of each variable, Justification based on literature. That is why step number three involves reviewing relevant literature and, of course, how the framework guides your study. That's what we're looking for in the conceptual framework. And then before I provide to you or discuss, provide you a sample of a conceptual framework and discuss it, let me proceed to step number six first. So in step six, um, step six involves creating a visual diagram or a schematic diagram of the conceptual framework. And I have a note here. This is optional but helpful. So I need to emphasize this one as well because we were taught, even in the undergrad, that when we prepare the conceptual framework, we need to, we think right away of the diagram of of um uh how the conceptual framework is going to be, prepared. We always think of the diagram, but again, the diagram is optional. What is after or what we're after, panel members or experts in research or reviewers, is the narrative explanation of how these variables and key concepts relate with each other. And why the schematic diagram of the conceptual framework, why we need to sometimes provide this one? Because the idea is when we explain in a narrative form the relationship between and among variables in the study, sometimes we cannot easily understand how these variables relate with each other. Even if we explain in a narrative form, still we could not readily understand how these variables, key concepts, factors relate with each other. And so the schematic diagram, a picture, an image of how these variables again relate with each other will help, in explaining, the relationship in the study. So that is why a visual diagram may help, is encouraged, but again, um, it's not necessary. And then here in step six, of course, we develop a schematic diagram or flow chart showing how the variables are interconnected. I also need to emphasize this one because sometimes, or I notice some masters and even PhD students mistake flow chart, process flow of the study for schematic diagram of the conceptual framework. So, and so the misconception is that some master students or PhD students or researchers, fledgling scholars in general, they thought that they thought that the conceptual framework is the same with the process flow of the study, which involves inputs, output process, and things like that. But my point here is please take note that the conceptual framework of the study is completely different from the process flow of the study, where it involves input and output process and things like that. So they are not the same. So in preparing the conceptual framework, again, there is a schematic diagram, or you may provide a flow chart. But this process flow or this flow chart deals with how the variables or key concepts in the study relate to each other and not the flow of the entire research. So please take note of that. Anyway, let me proceed now to so that's how that's the six steps in preparing and writing the conceptual framework. Let me now provide a concrete example of a conceptual framework in a narrative form, and then in the last slide, I will uh, provide a sample of the schematic diagram of the narrative that I have prepared. So let's take into consideration again the example of a study, titled Factors Influencing Student Engagements in Online Learning Among College Students. So that is our working title. And then this is the research problem. Step number one, be very clear with your research problem or gap, because you will not be able to clearly identify, determine your key concepts and variables and factors if you don't have a clear research problem. So in this study, factors influencing student engagement in online learning among college students, the research problem is, for example, just an example, with a shift to online learning, many institutions face challenges related to student disengagement. Understanding what factors promote or hinder engagement is essential for improving academic outcomes. So that's our research problem, step number one, right? Remember, in the steps in writing the conceptual framework. And step number two, we determine the variables. And step number three, review the literature. And step number four, establish the relationship between and among these variables. So once we have the research problem, again, that's quite clear now. We now determine the variables or key concepts involved in the study. And in this example, for example, um, the independent variables are, we have teaching strategies, we have technological access, and we have learner motivation. These are some of the, or these are the independent variables involved in this particular study. Okay. And then we can have the dependent variable student engagements. And then we can have moderating variable, which is digital literacy. So out of this problem and key variables, and I will not be able to come up with this strategy with this concept, the research problem and the key variables, if I have not reviewed some literature out there, related literature. So if you look at this presentation, this slide, this already covers step number one, which is again identifying the research problem that we want to see addressed in the paper, and then the second step, which is identifying the variables, determining the variables or key concepts involved in the study, and then step number three, of course, step number three talks about reviewing relevant literature, and step number four in the previous slides talks about establishing the relationship between and among these variables. So this is what we will do now in step number five. We will provide a written narrative of how these variables, in this case we use variables, relate to each other. So this is exactly what we mean by the conceptual framework. Okay, so with this problem and variables, we can now proceed to providing you with a sample of a conceptual framework. That's it. So this is quite small. I will provide a bigger version of this example. We have 5 paragraphs here, so let me read all these paragraphs. Let me proceed with paragraph number one. Okay, which reads: this study adapts a conceptual framework that explores the influence of teaching strategies, technological access, and learner motivation and student engagement in online learning environments. Now, in the first paragraph, notice how I wrote the conceptual framework. It talks about all the variables involved in the study and the problem, of course. Okay? Let me proceed. Drawing from constructivist learning theory and recent literature on digital education. See, step number four. Step number three, conducting review of literature. The framework posits that the way instruction is delivered, for example, interactive content, feedback, and communication, significantly affects students' interest and participation. Access to stable internet and adequate devices also plays a vital role, as technological difficulties can discourage students from actively engaging in learning activities. And then I proceed to the third paragraph, which reads, additionally, learner motivation, whether intrinsic or extrinsic, is assumed to be a key determinant of engagement. Motivated students are more likely to attend classes, participate in discussions, and complete tasks on time. Fourth paragraph, digital literacy is considered a moderating variable in this framework as it may enhance or hinder the effectiveness of all other variables. Students with higher digital literacy are likely to navigate online platforms more confidently, thereby benefiting more from well-designed teaching strategies and available technology. And lastly, last paragraph, the framework guides the formulation of research questions, interview protocols, and the coding of qualitative data to explore how these variables manifest in the lived experiences of these students or of the students. So again, if we combine the five paragraphs that I just read, and this is how our conceptual framework looks like. It's just a short narrative narrative explanation of how the variables relate to each other. You don't have a very long conceptual framework. This is enough. Let me read it again for your advantage. Again, this study adopts a conceptual framework that explores the influence of teaching strategies, technological access, and learner motivation on student engagement in online learning environments. Drawing from constructivist learning theory and recent literature on digital education, the framework posits that the way instruction is delivered significantly affects students' interest and participation. Access to stable internets and adequate devices also plays a vital role, as technological difficulties can discourage students from actively engaging in learning activities. Additionally, learner motivation, whether intrinsic or extrinsic, is assumed to be a key determinant of engagement. Motivated students are more likely to attend classes, participate in discussions, and complete tasks on time. Digital literacy is considered a moderating variable in this framework as it may enhance or hinder the effectiveness of all other variables. Students with higher digital literacy are likely to navigate online platforms more confidently, thereby benefiting more from well-designed teaching strategies and available technology. And the framework guides or this conceptual framework or the framework guides the formulation of research questions, interview protocols, and the coding of qualitative data to explore how these variables manifest in the lives or in the lived experiences of students. So again, this is a concrete example of a conceptual framework. This is how we prepare the conceptual framework. Again, what I did here is simply explain the relationship between and among variables in the study. Of course, after determining the problem and determining the variables involved in the study. That's it. I'm done. However, step number 6 talks about coming up with a schematic diagram, a flow chart, or a picture of how these variables relate to each other. As I mentioned already many times, as I already mentioned, the schematic diagram is not necessary. But sometimes it helps if, if the discussion is quite complicated or if readers could not readily understand the narrative, then the schematic diagram in this case will help. So I will end my discussion with the schematic diagram of the conceptual framework. Let me briefly explain this. So this is exactly the schematic diagram of the conceptual framework. This is the picture of how the variables relate to each other. You have here, the oblong or the variables, yeah, and then the arrows and the rectangle and things like that. Okay, so this diagram illustrates a conceptual framework showing how various factors influence student engagement with one variable acting as moderating variable. Okay, so this diagram can be explained this way. So, for example, we have here teaching strategies influence student engagement. So please take notes that my discussion here is actually just a repeat of the previous slides where I presented to you the narrative explanation of how these variables relate to each other. Anyway, let me again explain the schematic diagram. In this case, if you see, the oval there, the blue oval. We have teaching strategy, and we have an arrow going down pointing to technological access, which means teaching strategies influence student engagement. And so this means effective teaching strategies directly influence how engaged students are in the learning process. For example, interactive or student-centered strategies can increase participation and interest. And then if you look at the diagram, we have there the backs for technological access and an arrow pointing to student engagement. So this means technological access influence student engagement. Let me explain this very briefly. This means access to appropriate technology, for example, the internet, devices, digital tools, enable students to participate more fully, particularly in digital or blended learning modality. And then we have the backs for learner motivation, and the arrow is pointing to student engagement. So as you can see, it also influence, student engagement. And this means highly motivated students are generally more engaged. Motivation can stem from personal goals, interest in the subject, or confidence in one's ability to succeed. And we have at the bottom another variable. We call that moderating variable, which is digital literacy. And as you can see, the arrow points to student engagement still, and this means digital literacy as a moderating variable also influence student engagements. This means, very briefly, let me explain this. Digital, digital literacy moderates the relationship between the other variables, especially technological access and teaching strategies and student engagement. This means further that the impact of technology and teaching methods on engagement may depend on how digitally literate the student is. For instance, a student with high digital literacy is more likely to benefit from tech-based instruction than one with limited skills. So that's how we explain the relationship between and among variables in the diagram that we have. But then again, this is just a repeat of the narrative explanation of the relationship between and among variables that I just presented in the previous slide. So that's how we prepare the conceptual framework. What a conceptual framework is, and the how and the why is it important in our thesis and dissertations, and the third objective, how to write. The steps involved in writing, preparing and writing the conceptual framework. So that's all for this video lecture. Thank you very much. And yeah, I wish you all the best in your thesis and dissertation writing. God bless everyone.